It's very nice to see you all, and thank you all for making it here at 4 o'clock on a February Tuesday afternoon. The good news is it's still daylight outside, so I always like to take that as a key point in the year. And I think that we're going to have a conversation that will be really quite interesting, not because of anything I will contribute to it, but because of our lovely esteemed panel and the insight that they have to share. So let me start at the beginning. My name is Sinead McBrearty. I'm the Chief Executive of Education Support. And Education Support is a charity that's been around since 1877. And we have always existed to support everyone working in education. And these days, our mission is really about improving the mental health and well-being of everyone working in education in all settings across the United Kingdom. So very delighted to welcome you here to this particular webinar, which is focused on how can school staff help each other with mental health and well-being. We spend a lot of time in the sector talking about things that are difficult and tricky, that are outside of our own control, and really understandably, because there's a lot of stuff in the sector that can be problematic. But today's webinar is really intentionally focused on stuff that we can do ourselves. And I think that's really important, because when we feel like we've got some control over what's going on, when we feel like we can take some action immediately, that improves our own sense of well-being. So I think that's very much where we're coming from today, not because we're trying to improve people's sense of well-being so that they can do a better job or for any other external reason. Actually, it's so that we can all look after ourselves and stay as well as we can. And as part of a community of others who are doing exactly the same thing, we'd like to share the learning. And that's why the panel experts here are all people working in schools in the UK. So let me introduce them to you, and I'll just explain briefly. This is a conversation. We haven't come with flashy presentations. We don't have 5 steps to well-being nirvana or 3 tools that you can take away and use. This is very much a conversation among professionals. I'm here to keep an eye on the chat, and where there are questions that you ask that seem really juicy and interesting, I will ask them. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared. If you type a question into the chat, I will either refer to the questioner by their first name or by no name. I'm very happy if you type anonymous. I'm very happy to leave you anonymous when I read it out. The chat doesn't get recorded, so nobody will know where the questions come from. So you can feel confident that you can ask a question in this group, and that's not going to reveal anything that can be shared beyond the confines of this particular meeting. So I'll stop there. Let me introduce you to the fantastic panel. We've got the wonderful Lynn Lee, who is the head teacher at Lee Church of England Primary School in Coventry. And Lynn has been teaching across a variety of settings and has made it her business to learn from the good practice she's seen, but also the stuff that's not been so good. She's got 2 children of her own, which we all know is quite a good training ground in practicing well-being, and she comes from a family of educators, and she's been the head there since May 2020. Sarah Mullen is the executive head at an all-through school in the West Midlands, but also supports teachers through CPD coaching and mentoring. And Sarah received the Contribution to Education of the Year award and was shortlisted as a finalist out of 28,000 people as a positive role model by the ITB National Diversity Awards. In 2020, she was named as a rising star in education, and she's the curator of What They Didn't Teach Me on my PGCE. So we're delighted to have her here today. And Sanjay Badham is the lead therapeutic practitioner and safeguarding lead at James Brindley Academy. He's a practitioner, obviously, therapeutic practitioner, and has worked with children and young people in various complex needs across 11 sites in Birmingham. He started his work as a teaching assistant and then moved into management, and now specializes with counseling, and is absolutely passionate about psychology and what the psychological lens can bring to our practice in education. So we're delighted to have Sanjay here today to bring that perspective. And we're going to dive straight in. So Lynn, I'm going to turn to you in the first place. And I'm curious, in your time in education, in all the different roles you've been in, What have you observed about relationships in school, specifically relationships, and tell us what you've noticed and observed in your time?
Obviously, I believe, and I think it is a thing, that relationships are the crux, the foundation of everything. If you want to achieve something, then doing that with other people and embracing other people, empowering, encouraging, scaffolding is a huge responsibility, but it's also the way forward, making sure that those people feel valued, and their well-being is looked after, and it isn't just a nominal thing. You know, one of the things I'm really passionate about, that well-being isn't just oh, but I put treats in the staff room, or I say hi in the morning, or at the end of half term I give them all half a day off. I've heard that so many times throughout my career. That's not well-being, that's just good practice. The well-being is the thread that connects all of those things together, so that people can feel valued, get their points heard, feel like they're part of what you're creating within a school, and that go home, you know, that old adage of the end of the day, knowing that whatever they've done has made a difference, and that they make a difference, and everybody in school or is not necessarily aware of that through a big song and a dance, but actually that there's that acknowledgement there as well, to make them a better practitioner, to want to turn up the next day and build on those foundations.
That's lovely. There's a lot about community in that I think we'll come back to when we get into this a bit further. Sarah, I'm really interested in your perspective on this theme of relationships and community, and how you feel. What have we learned around in the context of pandemic? Because that's, of course, shed a different light and let us observe our own practice through a different lens.
Yeah, I think overnight we had to adapt our practice. We couldn't go to conferences anymore. We didn't have the real life staff room where we could communicate and share with one another. So we've had to really learn to reach out through other means. And through the pandemic, all we really wanted was to be surrounded by our loved ones. And around about Christmas time, we also didn't want our presents. We just wanted the presence of our family around us. So it really helped us prioritise who and what is important in life. I think during the pandemic too, it might have been the raised eyebrow, or the smile, or the shrug, or the wave, and it was the way we were communicating through masks or face shields or both, and really have that shared connection. I think nobody really understands what educators went through unless you were doing the job as well. So we really do have that, you know, shared connection between us.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sanjay, you know, you look at this, I guess, from the specific position of someone with that therapeutic and psychological lens. What do you find most interesting, and do you think is most valuable for us to think about in terms of relationships in a school setting between the staff team?
I think somewhat biased as a person-centered therapist. Relationships is the basis of what we specialize in, and I think from that perspective, the relationship is the outcome. And I guess when you consider education, there's so many outcomes that teachers are put on demand for, isn't there? There's the academics, there's the well-being of pupils, there's the engaging with parents, there's liaising with each other. And I think when you're in an environment when you're under that much pressure, when there's that much demand put on you, and then you start to consider well-being, it's almost like relationships amongst each other is the only thing you have, and you have to create almost like a family environment. And I like the idea of communities. I think it's amazing. But yeah, without the relationships amongst each other, where people are attuning to what's going on with each other, when you consider the pandemic and coming back, there's lots of kind of social signals dealing with people's presences that we missed out on, and you have to kind of relearn to a degree, because we have to come back being at a distance with people. But I think, yeah, it helps us deal with the tension and pressures throughout each day, if we're in good relationships with each other.
Lynn, I want to come to you, because I know that you have spoken in the past about culture and what it is that leaders do, but actually it's not just school leaders, is it? It's everybody in the school system who's involved creating that culture in which relationships can thrive and flourish. What do you think are the most important elements of supporting good collegiate relationships? When have you seen it work really well?
it's developing that culture, but it's also making sure that anyone that comes into that setting is embraced into that culture, but also that's done in a way that isn't oh, look how great we are, welcome. It's look at, you know, knowing people's strengths and weaknesses, knowing, you know, is there a certain place that I shouldn't quite sit in the staff room on a Wednesday because such and such sits there, and that might tip them over the edge. And you know, people that come in to your setting, or whoever it might be that visits, needs to know some key facts and key pointers to make sure that they can then embrace that culture and be part of that culture. And they might have things that they need to share, or things other staff need to get used to. And it's about that sort of the interaction. It's about how you set up that culture and how you engage people and embrace them into that, and also how you allow people to be themselves. Not everybody has to be the smiley happy face, or they're not in a great mood because look at, you know, they look miserable. They might just look miserable, and that might be okay. They might be perfectly happy, you know. They might not be, you know, might not want to come into the staff room every day because that isn't just their thing. So it's about enabling staff and empowering them to be who they are, and to make sure that that's okay and accepted as well, and knowing when the dynamics of those things as well. I think that's really important, and bringing people together. Almost sometimes we force some of our staff to come together because that is a thing that needs to happen, but we also allow them to be individuals.
I love what you say there about allowing people to be authentic, and I think this can be a really difficult thing in any workplace, actually. But it, you know, particularly so in schools, because in a school, very often colleagues are holding multiple roles in the course of the day, in terms of the different responsibilities they have with children and young people, the relationships that they have with staff, the relationships that they have with senior leaders, with governors, potentially with parents, let alone their own identity in the rest of their lives. So the idea of being an authentic self can be quite difficult for people to know where those boundaries are and where those lines are. So it's really encouraging to hear you talking about encouraging people to be their authentic self. I'm curious, have you come across moments where you think, yeah, this has been really positive, allowing people to, you know, have that authenticity? And have you come across moments where you think, okay, that's a little bit too authentic? That's, you know, Sinead's rocked up to work and she's clearly grumpy. She needs a second breakfast and an extra strong coffee. She's a little too authentic this morning, a little too comfortable being herself. Have you seen that happen? And when it does, how do you handle that?
I see that regularly when you're juggling different personalities, and as a leader, I've got members of staff who you can tell when they're not having a great day, or when they can't, you know, we always sort of talk about leaving it in the car park. You know, when you walk through the door, you have to sort of have a little bit of that I'm in my role now, but there are certain things we all know that you can't just leave at the door, and things affect everybody because we're human. And I have people, I can give you an example here. So a scenario the other day, one of my members of staff, you could hear her, she was clomping up and down the corridor, and I was like, there's something not right here. But actually, if I go and say, are you in a mood? That isn't the way that needs to be. So it's that offer, and that offer of help. You know, is there anything I can do for you this morning? Can we team teach first thing? Would it be helpful if I saw the children in while you did? But also, it's sometimes making sure that the right person is doing that. Because if that's me, potentially as the head, that seems could be perceived to be a little bit more sort of not obtrusive, you know, a little bit more powerful, or in essence, when actually it might just be their friend that's a TA or somebody they know that can just go and have a little word or a checkup or whatever it might be. So it's kind of knowing who needs to be in those strategic places. And the thing with sort of quirks and those things, it's not just a quirk, it's embracing everyone. I did a hot chocolate bar for staff in the month of December as their sort of just a pre-Christmas reward in a sense, but it was just set up, there was no biggie about it, it was just there, but it had a variety. So it had vegan, it had options, because I know some of my staff go to Slimming World, it had all of these things, not done overtly, but done so that everybody could go in there at some point and access something that was pertinent to them, and nobody was left out.
I love that. I can sense the various colleagues from my team on this call planning a petition around a hot chocolate event. So thank you, Lynn, for bringing that to my life. Sarah, I can see that you've moved room, and I'm going to ask you a question, then I'm going to come back to Sanjay. Kat has put in the chat and just asked, when Lynn was talking there, she was making the point that, we do need to bring people together. And as leaders, those who have leadership responsibility at whatever level, we're often trying to bring people together, and sometimes knowing that people don't always want to be brought together or not in that particular configuration. How do we deal with that when sometimes we think that the bringing people together, trying to build those relationships, sometimes actually puts more of a strain on relationships? How do we work through that, and how do we sort of keep a hold of the bigger picture?
I think it's about just doing with and not doing to. So, for example, enforced activities, there's absolutely nothing worse than that. Talking perhaps to the staff always, what staff want to have, maybe having multiple forums. It could be, for example, an open door policy. So if somebody prefers a one-to-one conversation, that's there for them. It could be small group teamwork, a buddy exercise. But also too, let's not forget the value of online networks. So, for example, through Twitter, there are so many friendships forming, so many ways that people can reach out and talk to other people. That doesn't have to be face to face, and can be anonymous as well. I do agree, and especially too when it's forced and people have to stay and it's after school, when actually they'd probably benefit a lot more from going home and having a good sleep and invested in their own time and family as well. So I think really listening, putting it out there, and having different options for people.
Brilliant. Sanjay, I'm curious. I'm going back to this example that Lynn gave. And so I've got a colleague stomping up and down the corridor outside. I can tell by the quality of their footsteps that they are not having a good day. How can I be a good colleague in that situation? Lynn talked about, making the right connection to go in. And what's very interesting is the response that Lynn has is, let's connect people, let's bring people together. But let's say that I'm the person who's making that connection. What do I need to hold in mind to be a good colleague to someone who's not in a great place?
Yeah, well, I guess that can be a difficult question. I guess maybe I'd feel pretty confident approaching them based on what I do as a specialism. But I think in terms of we're thinking adaptive practice that everybody can kind of take on, I think you've really got to attune yourself to what's going on in the situation. What works for one person doesn't work for another. Going back to what Kat said, I'm a good example of, if I'm not in a good mood, I don't want anybody around me, for example. I'd like to kind of process and get things together. And I just think rather than trying to shift on getting that member of staff to do something, I think the key point about being with them is, just being very open initially. Are you okay? Is there something that you need? Do you need a break? And I guess, I think we all suffer from that in this profession, that we do have that professional pride. We don't want to be seen as weak. We don't want to show our vulnerability and say, I'm throwing the towel in kind of thing. But making someone feel comfortable that, you're not throwing the towel in. Be okay with that vulnerability. I can cover you for 5 minutes if you need that. But yeah, I just think being very open and do your best to empathize with it, if that makes sense.
It does indeed make sense. I thank you for that, Sanjay. I'm going to ask all three of you, actually, and there's a lovely question from Helen in the chat here around and in fact, I was having this conversation with colleagues of mine today at the office, that through the pandemic, we've lost social capital. We haven't had that easy co-working, and all of the old structures and practices that were just part and parcel of doing the job have kind of faded away, or they've been amended, or they've been risk assessed out, and they no longer exist. So we're in a new way of working still a lot of the time. And even as some of the old things come back, it's still not regular and guaranteed. So Helen's question here is, some of us have lost the muscle for being together and working together and interacting together in that kind of collegiate way that used to be the norm. So my question to all three of you panelists is, given that that's the kind of disrupted context, what kinds of things can we be doing to help rebuild that social capital now in this, we still have all the issues of pandemic going on. Things might normalize a little bit, but I guess not wholly. But while we're still up and down to some extent, what can we be doing to bring that social capital back and build it up again? Lynn, do you want to kick off there?
Yeah, can do. And I'll relate it back to kind of what I said before, that sort of not forcing, which I didn't mean physically kind of putting everybody in a position that they don't want to be in, but offering, like Sarah was saying, those variety of situations. Because I know when I put events on or done something in the hall after school, that people have come and realised it's not as bad as they thought it was going to be. The anxiety, I've had staff that isolated from the very beginning of the pandemic, who had vulnerable letters and seemed to be off work for a long time and lost that socialization skill, but actually what they'd figured in their head wasn't as bad as the reality of the situation. So starting with those kind of Teams meetings, a bit like we are now, but where it's in a phase, and then a little bit adding additional people in, or starting with teaching assistants and then building that up, but also still offering and having those whole school events. Doesn't mean that actually in a whole school afternoon tea that I've put on, I'm not forcing them to come, but I'm giving them that opportunity. You might stay for 5 minutes, you might take your scone and go home because you're not in the mood to stay. None of that is judgmental, but it's having those opportunities. I've got a member of staff who does not go in the staff room. She's like, it's just not my thing. And then when we might have a pizza buffet or whatever, she'll go in and get a pizza. You can't get her out. But actually on a normal day, it's not her thing. So, but having those things, and there are days if she's not in a great mood, she'll say to me, can you just get me a couple of slices? Or say to another member of staff, yeah, of course we can. Because and again, it's that adapting, isn't it? And it's making sure that you're just giving opportunities, and you're being very mindful that everybody has had experiences and has different days, and riding those waves.
It's a really nice point. I have to also, as an aside, Lynn, you know I have the utmost respect for you, but you're going to have to stop giving me your examples. And we've now added a pizza buffet to the hot chocolate afternoon, and the pressure's rising here in Highbury. Fantastic.
But they're not the add-ons that I talked about earlier. That,
yeah, exactly.
In our school is the norm. That is, oh look, it's March, let's do whatever, and it's not even planned in. It is just we had somebody last Friday who brought in pork in a slow cooker and made everyone pork and stuff in batches. It's just, and it isn't just led from me, it's everybody, because everybody is supportive.
It's lovely. I love it. Sarah, I want to come back to you, and actually I'm going to move on because the questions are coming in thick and fast, so we're going to have to go more quickly with our question responses. So what I want to ask you, Sarah, for your thoughts on your immediate response to is, a colleague has said, what if your head teacher, so you yourself in the last question, Sarah, gave a really nice response and inclusive and, exactly the kind of leadership I want to be working under. What happens if the head is just stiff upper lip? Everyone just needs to pull our socks up and get on with it. How do staff look after relationships, and how do staff look after themselves when the leadership is less engaged in this than you might be?
I think it's really challenging. It's easy to say, harder to do, but I think it's so important to put yourself first, because there's no better relationship you're going to have, more important relationship you're going to have than that with yourself. Now, work will be there. If we left today, the job advert will be out tomorrow, but your family, your friends, your pets, they need you, and they're not going to replace you. So I think it's really important to prioritize that. Now, sometimes it may be you may have a pile of marking to do, or you may have a report to write. But if you need to go home and have a good night's sleep so that you're rested and better place to go into work the next morning for the children that need you, that's really important. I think what we need to take out of the pandemic is a real critical look at our practices, and really look at workload reduction, and what are we doing and what is it for? Are we just ticking boxes sometimes? Is it really moving forward the learning experience of the children? If not, let's review it. It is challenging if you're working with a leadership team that are not supportive of that, but I suppose it's really taking ownership of your boundaries as well. And I find that, even as myself, I find that quite hard to do, but really being positive about what are your non-negotiables, what boundaries are you going to put in place to protect yourself. Look at your timetable as well and build into your timetable which evening are you going to see your friend, or have you not seen a family member for a while, because that's just as important as saying, well, I've got this meeting after school. Really ring fence some me time for yourself.
I love that answer. I think I can still remember my shock in my first big job working in the city. The shock when I, finally after a lot of pressure left that job. The shock that they got on. The sun rose the next morning. The massive corporation I worked for carried on just as though I wasn't there. And you're right, Sarah, they had the job ad out in minutes. And I think it's a great moment for all of us to just reconnect with that sense of, the organization, the school will carry on, and we don't need to sacrifice ourselves and every inch of ourselves in pursuit. We are professionals. We may be absolutely motivated and passionate and feel like we have that this is what we are here to do, but that doesn't mean that giving every inch of ourselves in the cause is the right way forward. And actually, there's really good research that tells us doing that is detrimental to ourselves and to the job that we do as professionals. I think the other thing that I would add for colleagues where they're in that situation where the leader isn't fully engaged in this agenda is, for once, Ofsted has done something deeply helpful here by including well-being in their inspection framework. And Lynn can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it would be irresistible to any school leader if a member of the team came to them and said, just been looking at the inspection framework and thinking we don't have an explicit piece on well-being, and I'd be really up for leading a staff conversation and starting that conversation to make sure we're in the best possible place to meet the Ofsted framework. I think it'd be very difficult for a leader to say, no, we don't want to do that. And so I think, you can use that framework to start a conversation. Once the conversation starts, I think it's really difficult for any leader to not engage, because you're going to find that this is stuff that affects everybody in the school. So I think that's another, I realize you might say, well, I haven't got the time to do that, but it might simply be having one meeting after school once to see how people feel on this whole topic. And that just might be enough to shake it up. Sanjay, there's a question here. What if we have, after all of this and education support, we work with hundreds of schools across the country. So we go into schools where the culture is still quite buoyant despite everything that's gone on, and other places where even before the pandemic, people were really under the caution and struggling enormously. If you're in a school where the atmosphere in the staff room is quite grim and bleak, and there's that sort of self-reinforcing negativity that sometimes can happen, if you're part of a team that's stuck in that, what can people do to reset how the staff group interacts and to lift out of that sort of sink? From a psychological perspective, do you have a point of view on how that could be approached?
Yeah, I guess so, because I think when you have a bunch of people that are grouped together with the pressures that they have every day and the demands, it's only natural. There's going to be a number of you feeling dysregulated, not feeling great, and you mix all that together, and it's going to create an atmosphere that could be negative. I think the first thing is really trying to figure out how much it's impacting you, because in terms of my perspective on well-being within the workplace, not just education, is that I don't think work is ever going to resolve your holistic well-being. If we look at it from that perspective, there are many factors in your life that contribute to well-being. How many of those outside of work are not in a good place? And I guess when you get to the workplace, well-being is about, well, I guess, how well can you function? How good is your mood, kind of thing. I've kind of seen glimpses of comments go past, and I think if you do feel that when you're going home, you are unable to switch off, you are up at 9, 10, beyond that, still not feeling good about work, that's a real problem. I think that's, have that kind of have those reflections with yourself, really think about, how much am I being affected? Am I sitting here stressed? Is it affecting my relationships outside of work? Is it affecting my mental health, my physical health? And I think you should voice it to someone in leadership, and I think, I think if one of you starts doing it, because I don't believe leadership is about those in particular positions. I think we can all be our own leaders for ourselves. And, you know, I know it's a very person-centered thing to say, to say that, you know, the answer is within ourselves, but I do truly believe that. And I think that might empower others to share and say, you know, this isn't good for me at the moment. I'm going to do something about it. I think it's got to start with that, plant that seed initially.
Thanks a million, Sanjay. Appreciate that. Lynn, let me just ask you for your perspective on this, and then I'm going to come to Sarah about work-life balance. But in terms of this point of a staff room where the dynamic in the staff room has gone into a bit of a negative spiral, if you walked in to another school and you found that and you were asked to do something about it, how would you be thinking about the interventions you might make there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one, isn't it? And
Really
it's a
is.
big one. And I think, you know, I was lucky to sort of build up through the ranks here. So I was almost one of them, and then kind of saw good practice and bad practice, etc. In my career. And I think it reflects back to that. But also, I think it's a lot to do with empowering staff to look after their own well-being and notice those things. You know, it's not necessarily the leader's responsibility to make everybody happy. You know, that isn't a culture that's going to happen, but it is the responsibility to go and put systems into place where people can feel okay to talk. It's okay not to be okay, you know, and have the bad days and the different things as well. And I think, you know, and there are things about, you know, putting things out there that allow people to go and do what they want to do and embrace those things and have those different systems in school. And I think, you know, it's looking at those dynamics, and it's I know seen some comments in the chat about buddies and all sorts of different things, but I think it's what works in the setting you're in with the people you're in. You know, I personally couldn't think of anything worse than having one person who keeps an eye on me. You know, that for me would freak me out, basically, you know, and I'd be like, oh no, but because I'd want to be able to see who fits and what fits, and it might be different people for different days and different reasons. So it's sort of, there's all sorts of different ways you can do things, and all sorts of staff and different people respond to different things. So I think, you know, if you picked up and put into a different setting, what I'm doing here works. The culture, you know, the cultures works. If you speak to my staff, fingers crossed, and they have said different things, and I feel it and I see it, and I empower them to do it. It's not about me leading, it's about me empowering and scaffolding them to be the best they can be. So that's what I would try and unpick in a different setting if that wasn't happening. And it might not be what I do, it might just be what I enable them to do.
I think one of the lovely things that comes out of what you're saying there is the idea of we. And I think one of the things that can be really problematic when a culture gets into a negative spiral is you get a division between them and us. And people can sort of then reinforce this sense of negativity. And I think one of the things, if I were transported into that, well, first of all, everybody would scream because they'd go, this woman knows nothing about running a school. But once they got past that, I would be looking to engage people in a conversation. And whether I was there as a leader or whether I was there as a member of the staff team, I think it just takes one person to ask the question and say, you know, does anyone else think we could do with a bit of a shake up in how we are around this space? Because it feels to me like, you know, it'd be nice to see if we can do something a bit different. And does anyone else have an appetite? And I think if zero other people are interested in changing the culture, you then need to reflect on yourself as the one person who doesn't fit. But I would be shocked if you were the only person who thought it was time to do something different. And it never ceases to amaze me, and this is true in my work as an organizational consultant. It never ceases to amaze me how one small change can kickstart, you know, a different dynamic. And it might seem like it's nothing, but actually just getting people to reflect on that question and getting them to think about their role and their somebody's mentioned in the conversation earlier, agency and autonomy, putting them back in touch with their own agency to change what's happening in a space can be enough. And then, you know, people take that off and do what they will with it. So I love, Lynn, you coming back to the we in that and the idea of that community, because I think the strength is in these relationships for us all. Sarah, I want to turn to Mark's question about work-life balance. And I can see, looking at the time, that I'm not going to get through all the questions in the chat. So Gemma, I'm also going to say to you, if there are particular questions you think I need to get to, can you flag them to me, please? But Mark's asked about how do we do a better job around work-life balance. And I spend my life talking about this, Sarah, so I'm going to not bang on, and I'm going to be really interested to hear what your response is to what can we do here.
I think it's about, as leaders, modeling that behavior, show that you don't have to be the last person to leave the car park. On occasion, you know, make sure that you're showing that you're going home to your family, showing that, you know, some days are just going to be bad days, and the children forgot their PE kit this morning. You've been stressed on the way into work. I think showing just integrity too, that we are human. And I think sometimes maybe sometimes as leaders, we are working so hard that we are forgetting that maybe we're not modeling always the best practice, and we need to reflect on that. But having those conversations, I think talking about why as well. If we've why are we doing things, and what are they for, and why are they necessary, and why do they have to be done now? I think work-life balance, it's a really, really tough one. It really is, because I'm not brilliant at that myself, I have to admit. But again, I think if we have to just plan it into our practice so it becomes normal, even if you have to have a buddy in school or on social media who says, what have you done for you this week? Are you still, make someone force you? Are you coming here? Are you coming for a coffee? No, you didn't come last week. You didn't come the week before. You're going to come today. Put that down and really, positively encouraging people. That's really, really important as well.
Lovely. I think there's so much that's wrapped up in that role modeling. And I think, again, going in and out of schools, I've spoken to countless heads who speak to their staff and say, you really need to, look after yourself and do all the right things, whilst they themselves continue to work 80-hour weeks and don't recognize the impact of that message on staff. It's very powerful when staff see, either in your diary or you're really explicit, I'm leaving at 4 o'clock because I'm going to go for a run, or I'm going to see my mother, or I'm going to sit and watch the television. It's actually nobody's business what I'm going to do that's restorative for me, but I'm going to do something for myself. I think is incredibly powerful. I think the other bit that comes into this is, I think there are two objections people often have when it comes to how do I manage work-life balance. One is a lot of people feel guilt that they don't have permission to prioritize their lives. And I think this is a belief, actually. That's all it is. It's a belief that we hold, that we should or we shouldn't, we ought to do this or we ought to do that. And I think if you need permission, then take away the fact that in the research, it's really, really clear that looking after yourself, taking time off away from work to restore and recover makes a dramatic improvement to your performance professionally. So if you need permission, take this permission. You'll be better at your job if you stop working. That's it. There's oodles of research on this. So you can go home and tell them, go back to school and tell them that well-being woman said, if I put my feet up, I'm going to do a much better job. So look at me, my feet are up. I think it's genuinely true. There is an awful lot of research. It might be counterintuitive. It also requires leaders to be willing to let go of stuff and to re-examine, what does doing a good job mean? Does doing a good job mean ticking all the boxes and completing all the bits of paper? Or does doing a good job mean coming into school rested and recovered and able to do your best in that one thing that only you can do in front of that group of kids? And I think this is the conversation that we need to have. I think the other bit that underlies that, so one is your professional integrity, if you like. It is an act of professionalism to take this seriously. The second bit is many of us don't take ourselves seriously. So we don't actually, for all that we know this intellectually, it's bad for me to be stood here doing the, to be sat here marking books until 10 o'clock at night and not having any exercise and warming up a frozen pizza is not good for me. But I don't really take it seriously. I don't take it seriously until I find out that I've got a blood pressure problem, or until I find out that something else is broken in health terms, and then I might take it seriously. And actually, a big bit again goes back to that belief bit of, when are we going to take ourselves and our health seriously? And work-life balance works when you prioritize life. You know, the research is the work improves. So I think that would be what I would leave people with there. Sanjay, I want to come to you and ask, when people have folks in their team who are just working too hard and are at risk of burnout, what's the appropriate response as a team leader or a colleague?
If you recognize it, try and I think give them. I think they'll need a level of validation that you're doing okay and what you're doing is enough. I know there's a famous quote from a psychologist called Winnicott about good enough is good enough, and you know that's always stuck with me because I have that bad habit myself over the years of overworking and thinking I'm only going to prove myself as a proficient member of staff by just grafting and grafting, and you know, oh, there's still a problem. Oh, I'll go and do that. And I think really you're role modeling to people that burnout is okay as long as the outcomes are there. And I think we've got to just take a good look at ourselves there. I think, you know, and I've said this in other discussions, but if any of you ever heard of Alfred Adler, he did some work on psychology and family psychology, and there's lots of factors that come into that. And when you talk about personalities and the dynamics, a lot of us, we carry our family with us everywhere we go. When you're working with a group of people, I can 9 times out of 10, what's going on with your family is following you into the workplace, and your kind of internal self will gravitate you towards fulfilling the same role, but that might not fit with the professional hierarchy because the family roles change within the workplace. And then, you know, I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone if I say, you know, families can be very dysfunctional. I don't think any of us have figured out that issue. So don't put that pressure on yourselves that you're going to solve it in a day. I think it's going to take time. But I think what everyone does need is that level of transparency. If your expectations line up with what happens at work, it takes so much psychological tension out. And that also helps with the boundaries, like everybody's talking about. If you had that conversation with whoever above, turn it from me and you to we, and that, okay, leaders are saying this is as much as I can give, if I'll be honest, this is what we're working with, and you say, okay, compromise, we can work. And that, I think it takes a lot of the animosity out of it. I know there was quite a bit in that, but I hope that was helpful in some way.
We're loving the taking the animosity out of it, Sanjay. Good man, thank you. Sarah, I'm going to come to you on line management because there's a nice theme in the chat here on this. And let me just actually interject and say you're my favorite ever webinar audience ever. These are the best, most engaged questions. So I'm loving this. And can you all please come back to every event that we host? That would be great. If you wouldn't mind, that may not be the best for your well-being, but it's clearly very good for mine. Sarah, this whole question of line management, you know, line management is discussed around workplace well-being a lot. But, you know, schools are not like corporate organizations. They're not standard organizations. Does line management really matter? Is it important in a school context? And how important are regular one-to-one meetings with a line manager, do you think?
I think there's the professional and there's the personal, and then there's the sort of the hybrid in between. So I think some things are unavoidable. You will have to have a meeting with your line manager if you're discussing a pupil progress or a behaviour incident, for example. So some of those are really important, but it might not be your line manager you go to for personal situations. Especially important with early career teachers, or if you're new to a school, you might want to have different conversations with different kind of people. So I think it is important because some of the conversations really are unavoidable. And fundamentally, I suppose we are all in this job because we want to help the children, and that's what we're all driven for. So that's important. But I suppose in terms of our own staff well-being, staff progression, it might be that you have different avenues to go towards for those conversations.
Lynn, what's your perspective on this? You know, how often should we be having one-to-ones?
I think it was alluded to a little bit earlier, wasn't it? That actually sometimes they're needed. Sometimes that's what people want. That's their way of communicating, or that's their avenue or channel. You know, and And again, in a digital age, there's different ways of doing things if potentially that's the way you want to do. It is a sad state that actually education is a lot about accountability. So there's got to always be those boundaries. And I think, you know, back to some of the other points about working too hard and balance, it's about the documents that you've got in school as well. So the policies, the practices, the marking instructions, the schemes, the guidance, and how simplified they can be to enable people to have a life. And then you've got those questions if you do have a meeting or a catch up or a point that needs to be brought across, that who's putting the pressure on who's, you know, are you putting that on yourself to be the best you can be? But actually, as a school, we're only asking for this, this, and this. So, and having those conversations, sometimes they are needed as a one-to-one so that you can have that coaching or self-reflection. Sometimes they are needed as a bigger picture if needed as well. And I think it's really difficult because it is almost that juggling act that you have to do every day, depending on who you're talking to, what the circumstances are, and what that looks like. We have distinct channels of communication so that people do exactly know, because I think sometimes if you don't have them, that causes unrest, because who do I go to and who speaks to who? And then you can have 3 people passing that story round. So we do have those distinctive channels where appropriate, but if that person feels that's not the right thing to do at the time, there are other avenues for them to explore also.
I think what's really important in that is that it sounds in that system that nobody's left with nowhere to turn. And actually, you know, we're not that different from the kids, really. We're all looking for an engaged adult who can support us, an available adult who can support us with the issues that we're facing, whether that's a direct line manager or I know there's a seam of conversation here in the chat about supervision, and professional supervision, you know, is something we talk a lot about in the sector, but whether it's professional supervision or other things in that space. Professional supervision is where you have a meeting with someone who's wholly independent from the work, but who can engage with you as a professional and help you to reflect on your practice as a professional. And, you know, in terms of how your practice is going as far as delivering the purpose of it goes, but also what the impact of it is on you and whether there's stuff you need to change. So it can be very valuable from that perspective, but you know, the very vast majority of education staff don't have access to it. But what everybody can have access to is colleagues within a school setting, the opportunity to do some peer reflection. Also, it's very easy to overlook. We talk a lot about reflection in school settings, but because of that, I think, accountability context we operate in, there's very little real time to have a kind of open-ended reflective conversation. I mean, obviously it needs to be boundaried. You can't have let's start a conversation and we might finish next Thursday. So there always need to be boundaries, but there's a lot of value in making the time for peer reflection. And I know that we have on some of the resources we provide, we've got a little e-learning that people can learn how to do peer reflection with others. But whatever the format is, something where you have space and time and are supported to look at what's going on in or outside the context of line management seems to be incredibly important. We've got another lovely question here, which I might put to you again, Sanjay, which is, how do you deal with staff members who are grumpy and who are not particularly open to conversation, and they are having an impact on other people? I have quite a strong response to this. I notice in myself, and noticing that strong response is probably quite helpful, people, in terms of how we take it forward. But Sanjay, I'm going to ask you, as the thoughtful, reflective, person-centered man in the room, what are your thoughts on that?
I know it might not sound probably like the quick response, but you know, the whole person-centered approach is, you know, I do have a lot of confidence and reliance on those humanistic skills. Like, you know, I do feel particularly comfortable gauging what someone's going to be more receptive to and what they're not. I think if the initial attempt to interact with them is quite, I don't know, let's say hostile, for example, I think some gentle reflection to them. So, you know, I'm sorry. That was quite upsetting. I received that quite badly. Are you okay? Do you think you need to go home? Because actually, I think, because the other thing is you have a duty to, if that hostility escalates, I'm not really looking out for them if I allow that to happen. So I think I'll be as empathetic, as congruent as I can, but just try and be as reflective as I can. But I think the important thing is getting the right space for that. You know, I wouldn't do that in the corridor. I wouldn't do that in front of other colleagues or pupils, because, you know, I just think you want to protect their dignity. And I think if they can't articulate how they're feeling, let's say, for example, then I think that might have to go to someone with a level of authority. But I think the way that's communicated across is important.
Thank you for that. I think this point about reflecting back what's happening, you know, we can afford to be kind. We don't need to take it personally and I want to use a word, and the words that are coming to my mind are bad words because it's 5 o'clock. So all snitty. We don't want to get all snitty. We want to reflect back with some kindness and highlight the impact of the behavior, and then see where we can take people from that. I think that's a lovely way to take that situation forward. What's almost certainly true is somebody behaving that way is not in good shape. So you may also want to have signposting available. For anyone who doesn't know, the education support helpline is available 24/7. It's 08000 562 561, and one of my beautiful colleagues will post that in the chat. But anyone working in education can call that anytime, day or night. And the people on the other end of the phone are there for this workforce and are qualified in how to have difficult conversations. I need to stop this conversation, which has never been so difficult for a webinar. You can see why we want to bring this kind of panel together with people who are in the field dealing with this stuff day in, day out, because I think too often the expertise is coming from people who are not on the front line. And I am just delighted that Lynn and Sarah and Sanjay were able to give us their time and to come and talk today. I now have to faff around and find a slide that I've lost. Anne or Claire, if you can find the slide, because it appears to have died when I moved from one room to the other on this webinar. We're supposed to share a slide. I can't find it. I'm sure it includes the education support helpline and the fact that we have a variety of free support and tools and resources available, free and available to all of you. So please use them. That's what we are here for. We will have more of these. I think give your feedback. My colleagues here are interested to know whether this is the kind of thing you want more of. I can see lots of lovely comments in the chat, so thank you very much. Gemma, is there anything else that needs to be said apart from thanking all of the attendees and participants?
No, thank you so much. It's been amazing, and all of the amazing services and things that you can come to us for will be circulated via email. We will try and take some of the very best comments from the chat and share those too. If you want to stay in touch, please follow us on social media at EdSupport UK, and you can see all of the great content that's come out of this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Gemma. It's always good to have someone who knows what they're doing in the room with you when you do these things, is my experience. So thank you to all the colleagues at Education Support for organising this, but mostly thank you to Sanjay and Sarah and Lynn for sharing their time, their expertise, their honesty, and to you, what a fantastic audience of people from all around, not just the United Kingdom, it turns out, but Europe as well. It's been a real pleasure to spend this hour with you, and we will look forward to seeing you in some other format before too long. Look after yourselves, stay well. Remember that lady from, you know, the mental health place said you're supposed to take it easy and you're going to do a way better job, right? Go home with that. Take care, look after yourselves. Goodbye.